welcome to Expert Channel TV. Today we have another episode in the Golden Door Awards that we are honored to be hosting. So the Golden Door Awards, in case you haven't watched the previous episodes, are the first international writers awards on the foundation of truth and integrity, and they're given by work submitted in the digital content and written non-fiction literature. And today we have one of the top 20 shortlisted candidates who is opting for one of the awards. So please, Prasenjit, Basu, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Okay.
Good talking to you.
Lovely. So we are really interested in getting to know the person behind the work you've submitted. So who are you, PK, and what do you do?
Right. My name is Prasenjit K. Basu, PK for short. I'm an economist by profession and a historian by passion. I've been covering the Asian economies now for 30 years. I started in the United States in 1990, moved to Singapore in 1994, and was in Singapore for 25 years. I now live in Manila. So but throughout that time, I have covered the Asian economies, and whenever I travel a lot across the region. I always I delve into the history of the country that I'm visiting in great detail. And in the course of doing that work, I came to realize that most people in Asia don't know Asia's history. Asia's recent history is unknown. And even the older history of Asia, the fact that there are such deep connections across the continent, are not very well known to people. And so I decided that it's really important for Asians to know each other's stories. And hence this book. I wrote a book called Asia Reborn. It's a rather thick book. It's 680 pages. But it addresses the modern economic and political history of the whole of Asia, all the way from Turkey in the west to Japan in the east, with everything in between, over a period of a little over a century, the 20th century up to the present day. And in the first chapter, I delve into the historic links across the region and how Asia came to be colonized by the beginning of the 20th century. So a lot of the story is understanding how Asia, which was supine and struggling at the beginning of the 20th century, rose from these difficult beginnings to become the most dynamic region of the world by the second half of the 20th century and the first 2 decades of the 21st. So that story is what I explore. And I explore, of course, the links across the region that bind all the countries together. And the hope with this book is that Asians will not only know each other's stories, understand each other better as a consequence, but also develop deeper interstate relationships that will endure and help to bind the region more peacefully together.
Absolutely, and that is so interesting, because as human beings, the only way we can go further is when we know our starting point, when we know our history.
Absolutely.
And it's also a great way of bridging gaps and emphasizing and building empathy among different cultures and even among different cities and towns and not even countries, because when you know your history, you're able to understand somebody else's perspective better. So,
yes, indeed. Living in the Philippines now, I'm struck by the fact that the Philippines has been influenced by China, of course, because it's a neighbor. But 500 years ago, when Magellan was seeking to circumnavigate the globe, he encountered people who were either Muslims or Hindu. There were two types of peoples living in the Philippines then. And so they were influenced either by Indonesia or India, and to some degree by China. So there were interrelationships that went back 500 years, most of which are now completely forgotten. There's hardly any record, apart from the fact that they know about Sri Lapu-Lapu, the person who fought Magellan and defeated and killed him. But very little is known about Lapu-Lapu. So if you begin to explore those deep relationships, and then you begin to look at how the Philippines came to be colonized by America, before that by Spain, you begin to understand the cultural legacy that animates the Philippines. And once you understand that, then it's easier for other countries in the region to relate to the Philippines. Similarly, you go to a country like Iraq. Why is Iraq now struggling with fratricidal conflicts between Sunnis and Shias, between the Kurds and the Arabs? Now, these are all things that go back to the 1920s. Exactly a century ago, Iraq was taken over by Britain and made a mandate territory of Britain, effectively a colony. And artificially, three different diverse regions were put together and bound into an artificial country with a Sunni king over a majority Shia population. And that laid the seeds of the conflicts that Iraq still faces today. So understanding these things I wish George W. Bush had the opportunity to read a book like mine in 2003 before taking the decisions that he took, or Tony Blair for that matter. Had they had a real opportunity to delve into the true history of what had happened to Iraq between 1920 and 1965 and beyond, then they perhaps would have been more modest in attempting to transform Iraq without understanding the intricacies of the difficult landscape they were entering.
Absolutely. The foundation of any conflict resolution should be understanding each culture, each village, each town, it's where they're coming from. That would make things so much easier, and really meet them where they're at because of what they've been. I think sometimes.
Indeed.
Sorry,
Yes,
sorry.
Yeah, so you can look at a number of other cases. There's Indonesia, for instance, this great nation that was bound into a single civilizational state by the great kingdoms of Majapahit and Srivijaya. And yet, when the Dutch were ruling, they sought to emphasize the divisions, the disparateness of the different islands that constitute what is now called Indonesia. That was natural. A colonial power likes to divide in order to rule, and so the tremendous period from 1945 to 50, when Indonesia gained its independence, in the teeth of tremendous opposition, not just from the Dutch, but also from the British, who used the Indian Army of all things to try and re-establish Dutch rule over Indonesia from September 1945 onwards. In that period, if you understand that period, you understand the struggles that Sukarno and Hatta went through in order to create a united country of Indonesia. You then understand how the nation now has a tremendous sense of solidarity that is very difficult to break. And then you look at the period from 1950 to 65, there were so many attempts. There were coup attempts by the CIA. 6 or 7 times in the mid-1950s against Sukarno. And he responded to that by becoming more and more dictatorial and autocratic. And eventually, he was ousted through a CIA-inspired coup that was actually blamed on the communists. But in the end, the outcome that Indonesia had was a new dictatorship headed by Suharto, who was pro-West, who did a lot of good for the Indonesian economy to begin with, but eventually became increasingly corrupt because he saw himself as the dictator who could do no wrong. And as with many dictators, he went awfully astray as a result. So understanding that period, understanding the various pulls and pressures that Sukarno was dealing with, Suharto was dealing with, the interplay of international forces impinging on their decision making, all of that helps us to understand the final outcomes that Indonesia now faces. And once we understand those, then we can begin to engage, the world can begin to engage a lot better with Indonesia, with a genuine sense of understanding of what it has been through. And similarly with China and India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, the stories are in many ways gory. There's a lot of war, famine, periods of enormous difficulty. But over time, they eventually bind their nations together and then become inspirational stories of economic transformation, tremendous alleviation of poverty. What made that possible? And how Japan played a role of leadership that many of us now forget in leading the way, in demonstrating, first of all, that Asia had the ability to be independent and to develop a modern, successful economy. Japan did that even before the 1930s. And then in even greater degree from 1950 onward. So Japan demonstrated that it was possible, and then others began to emulate Japan's example. South Korea and Taiwan, ironically, 2 countries that were Japanese colonies, were able to emulate the Japanese example, and what they developed were not only rapidly growing economies, but economies that were egalitarian, far more egalitarian than, for instance, the communist country of China is even today, or the Soviet Union was at the height of its communist period. So interestingly, Japan, Korea and Taiwan, South Korea and Taiwan, developed rapidly economically, and at the same time, they were egalitarian, far more egalitarian societies in terms of distribution of income and wealth. So they then became beacons for others to try and emulate. And over time, China, under Deng Xiaoping, overturned the awful legacy of Mao. There's no getting away from the fact that the legacy that Mao had left China was of blood and gore and pretty anemic economic performance. Deng Xiaoping transformed that. Interestingly, among the models that he looked at was, of course, Japan. He was an early acknowledger of Japan's tremendous example, but for political reasons, he couldn't say that too publicly and too often. Instead, he used Singapore, a Sinitic society, a Chinese majority society that had achieved tremendous success with a slight variant of the Japanese model of economic growth, a variant that was dependent on multinational corporations driving the export sector. Deng Xiaoping adopted that. And he invited the Chinese diaspora to come to China, to invest, particularly in those areas from which they had left China in previous decades. So the Cantonese were invited to come to Guangzhou and Zhuhai. The Hokkien-speaking people were invited to come to Xiamen in Fujian province. And they did. They came in droves. and the tremendous transformation that they brought about in China is today there for us to see with our own eyes, and it's a remarkable transformation. The alleviation of poverty, of course, was the first element of that, but China today is almost a developed economy. It's a high middle income economy. Of course, it has problems of income distribution, but it is the world's largest manufacturer, the world's largest exporter, and a tremendous success story that others can seek to emulate, I hope, without emulating the authoritarian system of governance, but emulating the economic example, adopting the Taiwanese approach to politics. Taiwan is far more prosperous than China. It is a democracy, has been now for nearly 4 decades, and it is egalitarian, far more egalitarian than mainland China is. Not only that, if you think about COVID-19, the coronavirus that we're all dealing with now, Taiwan has been remarkably successful in controlling it, far more successful than all the authoritarian countries of Asia combined. So it has succeeded quite dramatically because it is a democracy, but it is a disciplined democracy. It is now ruled by a party that was in opposition for more than 35 years. And yet, it's a party that is democratic, that is fundamentally committed to democracy. Understanding how the DPP came to be, how the DPP came to represent the native Taiwanese people, and how they struggled with the Kuomintang, the KMT, who had moved to Taiwan from mainland China at the end of the Civil War. All of these things are aspects to understanding the true story of Taiwan's current situation. And then similarly, you look at South Korea. Not only did they emulate Japan, I mean, when they started out, Park Chung-hee was a former officer in the Imperial Japanese Army. So he greatly admired Japan. He adopted Japan's ways. And he wrote 2 books praising the Japanese approach, except that he said, what Japan has achieved in 60 years, we need to achieve in 20. And so he did it his way. There were periods of very rapid inflation, current account deficits. Right after Park Chung-hee was assassinated, Korea had to turn to the IMF for a big loan. So there were challenges along the way. But today, if you think about Hyundai cars, Hyundai and Kia, you've got LG and Samsung. Almost all the electronic devices we use are Samsung devices globally. And so all of that was a result of Park Chung-hee's approach. But I would also give credit to Kim Dae-jung, his great opponent. Kim Dae-jung was almost killed by Park Chung-hee. He actually had him dumped in the ocean. And interestingly, there was a positive feature here. The CIA intervened to rescue Kim Dae-jung from falling into the bottom of the ocean. They put a boulder on him and dumped him in the sea. The CIA sent divers apparently to remove the boulder and let Kim Dae-jung come to the surface. Anyway, but the interesting aspect of that is that Kim Dae-jung had to deal with the economic crisis that is called the Asian financial crisis. When he became president of South Korea, Korea faced the Asian financial crisis. Almost all its foreign reserves were exhausted. And Kim Dae-jung, during his 5 years, transformed the economy in interesting ways. He reduced the power of the chaebol conglomerates. He allowed greater democracy to flourish, not only in politics, but also in the economy. And as a result of that, we now have a proper functioning democracy in South Korea that sees the contest of ideas and is a truly modern, successful country in every way. So these are all tremendous examples. They're great stories. And if you grapple with these stories, if Other countries in Asia know the story of how South Korea and Taiwan and Japan achieved the tremendous successes that they did achieve. Then they can begin to emulate them and begin to focus on the aspects of the story that would work best in their own societies. Not everything works everywhere. Africa too could learn a great deal from some of these examples, but there are some aspects of the African heritage that may not quite work exactly the same way as for Korea and Taiwan. Some countries in Africa are beginning to succeed today. If you think about Ghana, beginning to see many aspects of the East Asian economic model begin to be implemented. So there are countries that are beginning to adopt many of the features, but not everything will work. So Indonesia could be a more relevant example for Cote d'Ivoire, perhaps. But the point about Asia is that when you look at the interactions of forces at work, international forces, domestic forces, politics, economics, and history, you begin to understand exactly why they are where they are. And once you do that, I think you have a much greater ability to use that elsewhere.
Absolutely. You are so right. If we're able to use those examples as lessons, we can really evolve as a whole.
Yes.
Yes, exactly. Knowing our history and a combination of knowing our history, our roots, the cultural nuances, and good leadership can really change a country. And that is inspiring. So your work sounds so absolutely fascinating. And from here, on behalf of everybody on Expert Channel TV, we really wish you the best for the awards.
Thank you very much.
And
thank you for your time.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure talking to you, and thank you for the opportunity to get this message out. The book is a daunting book. I acknowledge that 634-page book, 680 pages with notes and bibliography is a lot. But I was covering the whole of Asia and trying to understand the interrelationships across the region. And I think the point of it is that if Asians know each other's stories, then they'll be able to gain a great deal and use the lessons, as you pointed out, the lessons from each other's experiences to ensure that as they go forward, they don't make the mistakes that some of them did, and they pick out the best aspects and develop them and grow with them.
Exactly. And having that book as a reference is going to help at all levels, because I think oftentimes at community level, it's easy to understand each other. There's that empathy. There's people solve conflicts easier at community level. It's at top level where the problem is. Probably for other reasons. But if they can use your book as a reference, that would be absolutely amazing. So if you were to win one of the Golden Door Awards, what would that mean to you?
Well, it would mean a lot, of course, if I were to win one of the awards. I think the most important aspect is that it would give a great deal more publicity to the book, and it would enable many more people to read it, I hope, because the publicity would ensure that there would be much more interest. Now, if you've had a chance to read it, you'll find that the book is actually an engaging sort of set of stories. I tell lots of stories along the way. There are lots of interesting anecdotes, but it is daunting. It is a lot of pages, and not everybody thinks that history is relevant. So what I hope to have done is to show you the relevance of history. And once readers begin to understand the interrelationships, how did the First and Second World War contribute to the way we are today? For instance, they can look for those answers in this book. They can use it as a reference, but most of all, they can use it to understand how different countries in Asia affected each other in the past and how their current interrelationships have been affected by that past. And so as we go forward, hopefully policymakers, the general reader will all begin to understand the nature of the relationships across the region and how we can gain from that historical knowledge. So of course, it would be a huge honor if I were to win an award. But the important aspect is that the award, I think, would allow the book to gain the sort of wide audience that it needs. Having a small audience is fine. I mean, I think perhaps maybe 1,500 people have read the book so far, which is a small elite community in its own way. But it needs to be more widely read. And the purpose of writing the book was to enable the countries of Asia to understand each other's stories. I would like Singaporeans and Malaysians to know India's and China's and Indonesia's story. I'd like Indians and Chinese to know Indonesia's and Iraq's and Iran's story. And once they do that, once they have a deeper understanding of it, they'll have a much wider community of people, not just policymakers, but the common folks who help make those decisions through their votes and through their participation in public debate and discourse. The fact that they will all, there'll be a growing community of people who would have read the book, understood the interrelationships, I think would contribute enormously to a better understanding of Asia's position in the world and of Asia's future, and how we can build a community of amity in this great continent, the world's largest continent.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It would make the whole continent so much more powerful. And it's all about finding those things that you all have in common. That common thread makes you really, really powerful. So that, again, is such a fascinating topic. And again, we wish you the best. And I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us today, PK.
Thank you very much for your time as well.
Thank you. And to all our viewers, thank you so much for joining. Remember, you can follow the whole series on the Golden Door Awards on all our social media platforms. We have interviews with all of the top 20 participants. And I tell you, you don't want to miss any of these interviews. They are just amazing. These are outstanding people doing outstanding work in the world. And we also have an interview with the founder, the creator of the Golden Door Awards, and you'll be able to find out the inspiration behind these awards. Tahira Amir, she's a really interesting person. She's a woman of many talents. And we also have interviews coming up with the judges, and we will be asking them what they're looking for in all the candidates. So everybody, thank you so much for joining. It's been a pleasure. See you very, very soon.